Very well. Welcome, everyone, um, to the cover cropping opportunities in specialty crops. It's a webinar series brought to you by the Contra Costa Resource Conservation District and UC Cooperative Extension in the East Bay counties. My name is Kamyar Aram. I am one of your hosts today. I am also the crops advisor for the East Bay counties and started relatively recently. And we have co-hosting with me two folks from the RCD who will introduce themselves.
Hey everyone, my name is Ben Weiss and I'm the Agriculture Conservation Manager at Contra Costa RCD. I'll let Derek introduce himself.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Derek Emmons. I'm the Agriculture Conservation Coordinator with the CCRCD. And if you all would like to please introduce yourselves in the chat by writing your name, where you're from, and your favorite wine.
And if you have questions during Glenn's presentation here, feel free to use the question and answer section. We'll coalesce all those and then put them at the end, or maybe at the end we'll just open it all up and just have a nice little discussion. We'll see. All right, back to you, Kamya.
Thank you. So today, of course, we have really the pleasure and privilege of having Glenn McGourty with us to discuss cover cropping in vineyards. And Glenn has a long and distinguished career as Cooperative Extension Viticulture and Plant Science Advisor. He recently retired after serving for more than 30 years, serving Mendocino County as well as Lake County. And in the last part, he was county director as well of that office in Mendocino County. From the beginning, he has been a strong advocate for holistic management in farming systems, and he has played a key role in developing cover cropping and other sustainable practices in vineyards of the North Coast. And he is co-author of two key UCA&R publications for grape growers. Oh, here. One is, of course, Cover Cropping in Vineyards, a Grower's Handbook, and the other is Organic Wine Growing Manual. And actually, I believe, Glenn, you also had a large hand in wine grape varieties. Is that right?
Yes. So
many great contributions. And I really encourage you, if you have not seen the Cover Cropping in Vineyards book, it's a wealth of information that you can refer to, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, I think, today. Glenn is also an expert on Mediterranean and warm climate wine grape varieties, and I can attest that his presentations about grape varieties are a pleasure to experience and very informative to boot. He also farms his own wine grapes on the banks of the Russian River in Mendocino County. He was educated in plant sciences at Humboldt State and University of Nevada in Reno. And I gather that you are originally from the Paso Robles area. Is that right?
Well, my formative years were spent in Aptos in the Monterey Bay, and then I moved around, but spent some time in the Central Coast as well. So
great. And Glenn is certainly not slowing down in retirement, as he was recently elected Mendocino County Supervisor in November and is busy doing that now. But we're very grateful to have you, Glenn, take time from a busy schedule to present to us about managing cover crops in vineyards. And I am going to bring up your presentation. There we go. We have that here?
yes.
Yeah, so, and actually real quick to say, we will be doing a question and answer after the presentation. You can put your questions in the question and answer box, but since it's a pretty small group, I think we might be able to even open up and have a little bit of a discussion with everyone at the end. But for now, over to you, Glenn. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to tune in, and glad to see both Kamyar and Ben and Derek from the Resource Conservation District participating. We have a real active working relationship with the Mendocino County Resource Conservation District, as well as our Natural Resource Conservation Service office here in Ukiah, and we're thick as thieves when it comes to soil health and wanting to promote good stewardship in the vineyard. And increasingly in California, we have to prove that we're using resources wisely, particularly water resources in a year like this one. So I'm glad that we're here talking, because this will hopefully help you build up some knowledge about how important vineyards can be for taking care of things like changing climate and water quality and good stewardship of the land. Next slide. So when I started in 1987, this is what most vineyards looked like in the wintertime. There was not a blade of grass to be seen. This would be just spring ahead of spring break and a bud break, and you would see the herbicides used pretty heavily underneath the vines and everything distant tilled. And in some respects, you know, this wasn't a bad way to go from the frost protection point of view, but from the point of view of taking care of your soil, this isn't highly desirable. And typically what would happen, we'd do some frost protection, then they'd have to go out and spray, and before you know it, you had a rutted, muddy mess. So when I came along, I knew things could be done better just from my basic soils class that I took as a graduate student in 1978. I knew that there were things that you can do to protect your soil. Next slide. So cover crops are the things that we use for a variety of reasons. And first and foremost is to protect the soil from erosion. So if we look at water quality issues, particularly where I am, the biggest water quality issue in the North Coast is sediment. So anything we can do to keep sediment out of the waterways is really, really important. Cover crops can help regulate vine growth, both make them grow better or slower, depending upon what you want to do. We certainly can improve soil fertility. We can add nitrogen, and we can cycle a lot of nutrients a little better, like potassium and phosphorus will move through the soil better if they're in a organic matter matrix as opposed to being held by the clay in the soil, the mineral fraction. We can certainly improve soil structure. So soil texture we can't change, but soil structure we can. So as I describe it, a well-structured soil is kind of like a fluffy cake as opposed to a flat tortilla. And it's what we're trying to do is to make a sponge-like kind of quality to the soil that allows air and water to move through fairly quickly. Certainly, we can enhance biological diversity in the root zone. This is a new area of science that we're learning more and more about, and we probably have many benefits we're not even aware of, and it's possible we might be able to manipulate these benefits based on what kind of feedstock we put into the ground, what sort of cover crop that we use. And certainly we provide habitat for beneficial organisms both above and below the ground. So these are some of the reasons why we would use cover crops. Next slide. This is a nice diagram that Ann Thrip put together when she was working for Fetzer Vineyards as their sustainability officer. Cover crops have a lot of different functions in the soil. I added to her chart forage because in the North Coast, we're starting to do some grazing in the wintertime with sheep, and that's working out really, really well for us. We really, really like that. But we've already talked about some of these things. Retaining soil moisture is really important. Affecting microclimates can be useful, and again, attracting beneficial insects. So these are all things that cover crops do. Next slide. The thing that's kind of evolved in the last 10 years, I would say, is this whole concept of regenerative agricultural systems. And this is a system that seeks to promote soil and plant health by using photosynthesis for the removal and retention of atmospheric carbon dioxide into stable soil carbon. This is all part of a series of benefits that we get, what we call ecological services, by having agriculture involved in our ecosystem. And this is as farmers, how we have to start thinking about it. We're not just producing food and fiber anymore. We're actually doing a lot more than that, particularly in a place like California, where we're constantly being asked, well, what's the value of agriculture to our state? And besides feeding people, which is also pretty important, but of course we export a lot of things, we do a lot of real important benefits to the state and to our community by having agricultural crops growing in our ecosystem of the state. So this is one of them, is fixing carbon. And we can fix a fair amount of carbon in a vineyard. The vines themselves aren't that big, but the cover crops can fix a lot of carbon in a very short period of time. Ultimately, trees are the best way probably to fix carbon, but in a non-forest system like a vineyard, we can still have a lot of positive benefits. Next slide. So this includes all aspects of soil quality, of making the soil more receptive to taking water and holding on to it, and carbon sequestration, as we talked about, taking carbon out of the atmosphere. Active soil microbes are really important, and cover crops play a real role in that. High water infiltration rates and retention. This is really important because you've probably noticed our rainfall seems to be like mist and then downpours, and it seems like we're not getting a lot in between. So for those times when we get downpours, having high infiltration rates is really, really important. And by having cover crops, you really increase those infiltration rates. And then also protection of soil against erosion is one of the main reasons why cover crops historically have been grown. Next slide. So what do we use for creating healthy soil? Well, we've got several different ways to go. One of them is compost. Compost is more or less biologically digested organic matter that could be from a variety of sources. It's often manures and green waste. And typically during a composting process, we've reduced about 50% of the volume of the feedstock, and we have a fairly stable resultant carbon that goes in the soil that could last and have a positive effect for up to 10 years. Cover crops, of course, would be another way that we can do it, much cheaper in many respects and easier to do than putting compost out and spreading it. And then conservation tillage is another important way that we protect soil. So basically, the less tillage we do, the better off we are if we're trying to protect soil health. Next slide. So to go in the right direction, this is the kind of things that we talk about in soil health, is keep the soil covered. Whenever we can, we want to have cover on the soil. Exposing soil in California's climate, we evaporate organic matter, we break up aggregates, we start to lose soil structure, and infiltration gets reduced because of that. So if we can do minimize our tillage and soil disturbance and leave the soil in place as much as we can, that's a good thing. It's a good idea to have diverse plant species to increase biotic diversity below ground. So having more than one thing in the vineyard is a good idea. So the olden days, all we had were grapevines. So that's what everything ate, was the grapevines. And by increasing diversity in the vineyard floor, we're finding that we get control of things like nematodes and other kinds of potential pests and diseases to the vines. And if we can, it's great to keep living roots in the soil as long as possible throughout the year. So when we have living roots from cover crops and plants, we're feeding microorganisms and we're promoting biological diversity and soil health. Next slide. If we look at soil organic matter by percentages, you can see in this pie chart that there's actually different types of organic matter in there. There's basically the biomass, the purple wedge, that's the stuff that's alive and functioning as either your crop or the cover crop. And the next group is the residues that are leftovers from that are in the process of biologically decomposing or chemically decomposing. And finally, we're left with humus. And humus is a real stable form of organic matter, and we'd like to have high levels of humus in the soil. It's more or less the black stuff that coats all the soil particles. So when you see a soil that's really rich, as we say, and bottomland soil that's very black, it's because there's a lot of residual carbon in it, which makes up the humus. And that's the kind of soil that we like for growing crops. Next slide. So soils are really the stomach of our ecosystem. So this is kind of the nexus of the animate and inanimate world, as the biodynamic farmers talk about. This is where life comes to being, and this is where everything starts. So essentially, there are chemical elements in the soil, and by the use of microbes and plants, it starts to move up the food chain from there. So if we actually look at how much organic matter is in the soil, this is in kilograms per hectare. We typically, it's almost, I probably put the slide together for one of my European presentations, and I apologize because I don't, like most of us, I don't think automatically into tons per acre. The point I wanted to go to, though, really was the microbes. You can see that there's a lot of microbes in the soil, and in terms of individual numbers, they far outweigh anything else that's going on in there. So they're among the most prolific organisms, and they weigh basically, it's the equivalent of about 5,000 pounds per acre. So they're sizable in numbers, and you can see nematodes have a good presence, earthworms, different kinds of insects, and then also vertebrates. So this is just kind of a breakdown of population of life. So in a healthy grassland system, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of stuff that is contributing besides just the soil. There's all this organic matter that's both living and non-living. Next slide. So water is also held by increased organic matter. So a pound of organic matter can hold about 40 pounds of water, or 5 gallons. So humus is very good at holding on to moisture. So having humus in the soil, the reason that the soil becomes fertile is because there's water and there's biological activity that cycles things through. So if we can increase soil organic matter by 1%, we can store an additional 21,000 gallons per acre. And this is a good take-home message for you, because under cover cropping systems, we've seen in Mendocino County, we've seen some of our soils go from like 1.5% organic matter up to 5%. So by increasing those soils to where they hold 100,000 gallons of water per acre, we can pretty much go dryland farming on some of those sites. So we don't even really need to irrigate, which is really, really wonderful in a year like this one. It can be very, very beneficial for us. So certainly the potential to increase water storage by 1/3 in moderately textured soils is not beyond the realm of possibility. And as I've told you before, plant cover can increase infiltration rates by 200% compared to tilled soils. So that's a good reason for us to go to kind of a no-till cover cropping system if it's the right location and the right crop. That's huge when you can get that much water to move into the soil. Next slide. So one of the main reasons that cover crops started, particularly in the north coast of California, was to protect the soil. So cover crop foliage shields the soil from rain splashing and the slaking of aggregates. And what that means when you slake something is you're sealing it off so the moisture can't go in. So when you have cover crops, your water infiltration rates stay elevated. Organic matter is conserved by preventing erosion. And you also get this mulching effect to keep soils cool in the summer and protect organic matter from oxidation. Additionally, Australians are finding when they have organic matter on the surface of the soil, it tends to reflect less heat compared to bare soil. So under their conditions, they're seeing more heat reflected, and then they're consequently more water use by the vine. So it's another way that moisture is conserved when we have mulch left in the vineyard. Next slide. So when we talk about soil organic matter, plant tissue is the primary source. And the first thing that happens when cover crops start growing is the soil life is stimulated. This is because the roots have exudates, and the exudates become food for the microbes. The microbes are sitting there dormant, waiting for the party to start. And once you plant cover crops, things start to change. And cover crops serve as food sources for vertebrates, invertebrates, and microbes. So they are part of the food chain, the bottom of the food chain, but they definitely make things get going. And you can measure that fairly quickly by seeing the soil respiration rates and microbe numbers increase very, very rapidly when we have some moisture and organic matter in the soil. Next slide. I kind of look at cover crops as falling into kind of 4 categories, and I think that this is a good way of looking at it because they have slightly different functions. The grasses are an important group, and they really serve to bind the soil together. So if we have a potential erosion problem, we definitely want to have grasses in the mix. Their fibrous root systems are very, very good at not only penetrating the soil, but they also exude different kinds of waxes and things that will help glue the soil particles together and protect them. And in California, our cover cropping systems are really dominated by annual grasses. Legumes provide nitrogen. And then we have some soil carbon builders, which are different types of annual crops. Among the best probably would be the mustards and members of the mustard family. And then we might also have some special cover crops that we use for different purposes, such as insectary plants that bring in beneficial insects, and also disease suppression cover crops that we might use specifically to suppress nematodes or other kinds of soil-borne organisms that are bad for the vineyard. And primarily those get used during rotations. They can be planted into the vineyard, but I don't think they have near the same effects as if we're able to rotate the vineyard out and rest it between planting. Next slide. So here's a good example of grass roots and why they're so important. So you can see on the left-hand side of that picture, there's a piece of sod that's been taken out, and then it's been blasted pretty clean, and you can see the number of roots that are hanging onto the soil there. It's a pretty extensive network. And then on the right is a young stand of annual ryegrass showing the root development. The roots below ground are probably the same or even a little bit more in terms of biomass than the foliage you see above ground. So they're penetrating the soil, and they're doing a lot of good in terms of providing food for microbes and holding that soil together. Next slide. Small grains are often what we use. So there's different things. There's oats and triticale and barley. These are all common cover crops used in California. All have different purposes. Here on the North Coast, I really like triticale a lot because triticale has an amazing root system, and it has a long winter dormancy, which means that it doesn't really bolt until a little bit later in the year. So we can use it as a cover crop if we're trying to protect soil without creating too much biomass. Grains will produce a lot of biomass, so we can get 2 to 3 tons to the acre quite easily. So if we want to just grow organic matter, we can definitely do it with the small grains. They're one of our best choices. However, getting rid of that biomass can be kind of a problem, particularly in young vineyards, and might require a lot of tillage. Otherwise, you create a fire hazard, and we've had enough of that going on here the last few years, and to be concerned about our vineyards catching fire, especially a young one. Next slide. Here's an example. There's a great looking mulch, but fire hazard too. So this is one of the things that we have to take into account, is that we want to be sure that we're fire safe. And if we do this, we want to just be sure that the margins of the vineyard are mowed ahead of time, so that we don't have the ability of a fire to ladder right into the vineyard and burn everything up. Because I've seen that happen. It's not common, but usually our vineyard floors are not much of a problem under no-till. They don't burn that easily, but if you have this kind of residue around, they just might. Next slide. Perennial covers, they can greatly reduce vigor. So if you have an overly vigorous vineyard, this is one way that you can slow it down. I would recommend it for fertile sites. We can use grasses and legumes, but not annual and perennial species. They have to be one or the other. So if we're going to mix legumes into the cover crop blend, it's got to be a perennial. So the grass types that we've used with pretty good success include turf tall fescue, sheep fescue, creeping red fescue, hard fescue, and perennial ryegrass. So we see particularly in Oregon vineyards, sheep fescue, creeping red fescue, and hard fescue are used a lot because their soils are quite rich. They're trying to devigorate their Pinot Noir that they have. And the fescues barely need to be mowed, so they're quite good. So in your region, if you were in a place that was a little bit cooler and you had good soil, this would be the kind of things that you could use. As far as legumes go, white Dutch clover, Ladino clover, and strawberry clover are often put in the mix. And what's nice about them, if you put them in, they basically provide nitrogen for the perennial grasses, so you never need to worry about fertilizing the perennial grasses with any nitrogen. Otherwise, they tend to run out of steam and might die on you if they don't have enough nitrogen. Next slide. Here's an example of a nice perennial cover crop in a vineyard in Sonoma County that I believe is probably a turf type fescue, and it's devigorating that vineyard. Next slide. The legumes as a group have a few things in common. One is the flowers that you see there in the upper left-hand corner. They have these kind of interesting asymmetrical flowers. They're symmetrical right to left, but they're not round, and they have the center of the flower is called a keel. The seeds kind of look a lot alike, so the seeds all look like little beans, and a bean is a legume. And then a lot of the clovers are important legumes we use in vineyards, and some of the vetches. We've got to be a little careful which vetch we get, because some of them can get kind of weedy if you don't pay attention. If they get up in the trellis, they can really make a mess. Next slide. Legume roots are the really special part. So we can kind of see these little bumps on the plants when you pull them out. These are called nodules. And inside of them live bacteria, rhizobium bacteria, which you can see electron micrograph of them on the bottom right. And they're rod-shaped bacteria that have the ability to take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into a form of nitrogen that's usable by the plants. So we call this fixing nitrogen. And it's one of the best ways for us to make soils fertile without using chemical fertilizers is to plant a rotation or companion crop of legumes into the soil. Next slide. So they can actually make a lot of nitrogen. Most vineyard systems, it's rare that we get above 40 or 50 pounds, but you know, when they're grown particularly on their own in a rotation basis, like between vineyards, we can see some of them can fix up to 300 pounds for Bercine clover. Bercine clover is really amazing. I do note that with our perennial clovers, white and strawberry clover, the gophers love them. It's like candy for them, and they will definitely show up and thrive if they get into a planting of clover, of perennial clover. These things tend to have tap roots, and they will eat them right up. Next slide. The annual clovers that we rely on a lot include it, going from the top is subterranean clover, then the upper left, strawberry clover in the upper right, and the lower left. Oh my gosh, I'm not sure if I know what that is anymore. I forgot. But then the lower right is balanza clover, and these all, some of them flower pretty prolifically and are good insectary plants. And in the case of subclovers, their flowers aren't quite so obvious, and they aren't insect pollinated because they usually tend to bloom pretty close to the soil, and they set out a little peg and they bury the seeds down into the ground. So they're very good for reseeding. Next slide. The peas, vetch, and bell beans group, bigger seed, and these are a little bit easier to work with than the clovers are, because the clovers need pretty exacting conditions to get going. So unless you have kind of moisture in the soil when it's relatively warm, when the air temperatures are above 60 degrees, you won't get very good germination. Whereas these things being bigger seeded, we can seed them a little bit later and have pretty good results seeding them in your area. Even as late as December, they'll probably grow. So they're good in rotations. They do make nitrogen. They can be planted by themselves, but often they're mixed together with grasses. Next slide. Crimson clover and Blando brome. This is a really nice mix. Crimson clover works good for about 2 years, and then it tends to disappear out. So we like to use this when we're establishing a vineyard, and we want to be sure we're getting good erosion control. It'll make a fair amount of nitrogen, but unfortunately the seeds aren't very hard and they don't persist. So it will get 2 years out of usually a seeding and then nothing. The blandobrome, on the other hand, once we get blandobrome in there, it's very good at reseeding. And so if we're going into a no-till system for like a hillside, this is a really good mix. The blandobrome will keep coming back. And I usually also put in some subterranean clover and some other sorts of annual clovers, strawberry clover or Balanza clover or some of the others. Next slide. So this is a pretty good example. This is in Anderson Valley. This is a really interesting situation because this vineyard was planted in an old sheep pasture, and for years and years, the sheep folks used to periodically plant subterranean clover no-till. So after this vineyard was planted, nobody planted a cover crop here. They just stopped tilling, and the subterranean clover seed just came right on back because subterranean clovers will set hard seed that could last up to 20 years. So it's a beautiful cover crop, and then just to enhance it a little bit, I'd recommend putting on some phosphorus and soil sulfur in at least our high rainfall areas. It really helps them pop up and grow. So this is a pretty nice way to go on a sloping site that'll not have issues with soil erosion and very easy to maintain. So that probably only take 1 or 2 mowings with a rotary mower and you got it. And nowadays, we're also using sheep in the dormant period, and the sheep will also bring it right down like a golf course. Next slide. This is usually what subclover looks like as we're going into spring mow down. Normally around the 1st of May, it starts to get warm, and that's the end of the line for the subterranean clovers. They will go through and chop them pretty good close to the ground, and they'll go into dormancy, but they will have set seed and be ready to go the next time it rains and following fall, and you'll get a cover crop back without having to do a bunch of work. So that's why we really like these a lot for our no-till systems. Next slide. The soil carbon builders are also an interesting group of cover crops that have been widely used historically. So Napa Valley, of course, being famous for its mustard, and the old timers figured that out, and they had selections of Brassica campestris and some other brassicas, and they build a lot of carbon for a little bit of seeds. So for a $10 investment, you can buy enough mustard seeds to seed most of your vineyards. And I noticed Jerry Fry talking about his famous head-pruned Zinfandel vines there in Lodi. A lot of times you'll see these in old vineyards because they like to cross disc them. And if you choose the wrong thing, they can get to be kind of weedy. So like Brassica caver, which is black mustard, they can grow 6 or 7 feet tall. So I wouldn't choose that. I'd be looking for selections that are a little bit lower statured. So we have, you see a nice picture there on the left of tillage radish, mustard, and oilseed radish. I've grown all these cover crops. They're great. They germinate really readily, well into late into the season. They germinate fast, and they put their foliage out. So they're very, very good at protecting the soil. And some of them are also very good at reseeding. If you let them go to seed, they bloom fairly early in the year, and they'll set seed normally by March, about the time that we'd be disking under. So once you got them for good. You can see some of the oilseed radish there. The other, actually, I think this is a turnip, and for some of the people who are biodynamic farmers, whether they might run pigs or other grazing animals into the vineyard, this is sort of an interesting addition. And you actually can grow a fair amount of organic matter and feed at the same time using this kind of plant, and they grow well. Next slide. Here's just some examples of mustards and radishes being grown both in tilled and untilled systems, or minimum tilled, here in Mendocino County. So we like daikon radish is another one we really like to use because it germinates well, and then after you mow it, it leaves a nice big void in the soil. So particularly on clay soils, you're trying to improve infiltration. They're useful. Next slide. As far as insectary cover crops and plantings, a lot of these things are put together on custom blend basis. They're expensive, so we don't usually seed them all over the place, but you seed them in patches, and all the research that we've seen suggests that they're helpful, but they're not going to control every pest in your vineyard, but they still will bring in an interesting mix of generalist predators and parasitoids that may help with your overall pest control. The upper left-hand picture is an inflorescence or a flower of a member of the Umbelliferae, the carrot family, and I think that's Queen Anne's lace. And these are particularly good for bringing in a lot of little hymenopteran flies that, or wasps rather, that will attack and parasitize different sorts of Pearson-sucking insect eggs. So they serve as an alternate host of food for them. A lot of the adult little wasps really, they'll feed on pollen and it'll extend their life if they have it available to them. So instead of only lasting a week, they might last 3 weeks. So they can make a big difference, and in turn that can parasitize the eggs of leaf hoppers and aphids and things that might be in your crop. Next slide. And here are some pictures of dedicated insectary rows. This is actually from New Zealand, and they like to use a California native called Tansy facilia, the kind of looking flower on the left, as well as buckwheat. And these grow a little bit. The Tansy facilia is a winter crop, and the buckwheat's a summer crop. Growing buckwheat in California is a little tricky. I've seen it done successfully, but you have to work the ground and then seed it kind of late in the spring, normally like late April or May, and you seed it down into the moist level and it pops up and grows. It's a very good insectary plant, but a little hard to get going. However, I've seen it used well in particularly nice sites where we've got fairly good soil where we can get it started later in the season. But it's a summer annual, it's not a winter annual. Next slide. These are some of the things that we might find in there. So starting from the left and going clockwise, green lacewings, predatory mites, the kind of pear-shaped mite that you see is the predatory mite taking on a big two-spotted mite, and they're very good at suppressing mites. And I experimented with them in Lake County and had great success with them. And what made a difference was having a cover crop so that the mites had a place to be. If there was nothing to eat in the grapevines, they kind of go back and forth. They're fairly rapid little pests. Next picture is minute pirate bug, generalist predator and parasitoid that goes back and forth between some of our insectary plants. Then we have convergent lady beetles in the lower right-hand side. At least I think that's what they are. Then we have black hunter thrip. The black hunter thrip is really a voracious little predator. It's a thrip, but it's not a one that eats plants. It eats other insects. And I find these in vineyards where we've cover crop, they show up quite a lot, and they really will take on mites and leaf hoppers in the juvenile form. So they're really wonderful to have around. Very, very good biological control agents. And then finally, different kinds of spiders. Spiders are really interesting. We have a lot of them in the North Coast, and some of the organic vineyards I've been in, it's really fun. We would do some looking for them by beet trapping. So we put like a white sheet underneath the vines and then hit it a couple times with a rubber mallet, and all these little spiders come showering down. So spiders are kind of unsung heroes. They can eat a lot of other insects and things, and if you're not spraying toxic insecticides and you have cover crops and such, they can be really worthwhile to have in your vineyard. Next slide. Some of the growers get pretty creative with, they create cover crop rotations with the idea that we'll always have flowers in there no matter what the season is. So on the left, you see mustard in the wintertime. And then this particular grower, he's a biodynamic grower. And when the mustard goes out, he'll take and plant buckwheat in its place. He'll work up the ground and plant buckwheat by May. And then meanwhile, in between that, the alternate row is crimson clover, and you can see the crimson clover blooming there. So he's always got some sort of, almost for 9 months out of the year, there's some sort of flower resource for beneficial insects to take advantage of. The whole thing about beneficial insects, they don't replace insecticides, but they help. So we can figure if we've got a good fauna of diverse insects in there, they're going to eat about 60% of what's in the vineyard. So they're really helpful. They don't completely control stuff, but they sure add to the mix. And then if we have a specific parasitoid of like the leafhoppers with some of the Nrcs wasps that we have, we can really get it down to where you don't really have to spray much at all. And that's pretty much the case with a lot of organic vineyards here in Mendocino County. We sulfur dust and use stylet oil early in the season. That's about all the chemicals that we're putting in, and we're getting very good pest control in the vineyard. Next slide. Here's another idea on alternate row farming. So sometimes growers will farm no-till half of the vineyard and just mow it, and the other half they use crops that get tilled under, and they alternate the middles about every 3 years. So they're doing some tillage, but not complete tillage, and they like to be able to add organic matter and keep the level of fertility up a little bit more. We tend to find this in high production organic vineyards where their expectations are to get around 6 to 8 tons of Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc, and they need a little extra nitrogen. So they're putting on pretty good amounts of compost, like 3 to 5 tons in those alternate rows. And then they like having the no-till rows because in the springtime when they have to spray, it's very easy to get in. They're not stuck in the mud. Next slide. And compost is an important part of this whole process, particularly for organic vineyards. That's where we're getting a lot of our nutrition from. And 2 ways to go. You can broadcast it across the entire vineyard floor, which we often do after we seed our cover crops, or you can go under the vines, depending upon what your desire is for fertility. So compost is an excellent source of nitrogen, but also potassium and phosphorus as well. So the cover crops do need to have phosphorus fertility. So that's why using compost is great, because every ton of compost we put on, there's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 40 pounds of phosphorus in there, which is about the right amount for most of the legume cover crops we use. Next slide. Thinking about this a lot over the last few years, I've come to the conclusion this is the right piece of equipment to have. Unfortunately, I don't have it. I have a Clemens, which mows underneath, but I really like this under the vine mowing technique. And if I were going to design a vineyard, this is what I would design it to do, is to go to no-till. So one of my blocks I have not tilled since 1996, and the vines are very healthy. The soil's in really wonderful condition. It's only 1 acre, so I used to spray kind of a Roundup Chateau program, and I've kind of moved away from that. Now I weed eat it, and it's only 1 acre, so it's not that big a deal. But I've become convinced that going to a mowing only program using that mix of Blandobrome and annual clovers makes for a really good cover cropping program here in California. And if you're on fairly good soils, this is the way to do it. It becomes a challenge if you're on a hill or if you have terraces. It's very difficult to do, but certainly for flat ground, this is a nice technique. Next slide. I see these used in other places. The roller crimpers are popular in Australia because, again, what they do is they kind of crush their cover crops and just let them lay in place. And the roller crimpers, usually one pass for more succulent kind of cover crops, will get it so that they don't grow anymore, and then they just dry up and they're in place. And it's a technique to retain a maximum amount of organic matter on the soil surface. And mulching has a lot of value in dry climates to retain moisture in the soil. Next slide. I'm also a big fan of sheep grazing. So sheep are that mower underneath the vine I just showed you. So they're the living version of what the under the vine mower can do. And this vineyard on the left is set up to be grazed anytime. So normally for a lot of our vineyards, we have to get the sheep out once the leaves start to come out, but these vines have been trained high, so the sheep can't really reach the foliage. And the person who owns this vineyard, she also raises sheep to make milk. which she then in turn makes cheese from. And it's really good system. It's, she doesn't have to send a tractor out there to do anything other than dusting. It's an organic, almost biodynamic vineyard. And for kind of conventional vineyards in my own, there is a service where someone comes in with I call them up and they'll bring in 500 sheep on my 6 acres, and they'll spend 2 days and eat everything down to the ground to where it looks like a golf course, and then they're gone. And it makes it so easy to take care of my vineyard in terms of weed control when I've had them in there grazing. Chickens are kind of for fun. The biodynamic farms often have them, and they're great food for the wildlife. But they also provide eggs for fining and eggs for eating, and they're just kind of easy to manage and not expensive. And a lot of people have mobile chicken coops and electric fencing that they put around them, and it does work, and it's not a big hassle, and people do use them in their vineyards. They're very good at controlling cutworms and earwigs and other things, so they kind of add to your pest management program. Next slide. No-seed tilling is really a wonderful, not no-seed, but no-till seeding. That's really a wonderful way to go to seed. And I've had a lot of experience with it, but it's critical to have the right machine. And this is the best one that I found. This is essentially like a rototiller, except that it slices down into the sod a little bit. And then it has essentially a drop seeder on top that drops the seed, and it cuts some slits. There's coulters. It's a bit more expensive than regular seed drills, but boy, you can really do a lot of good things with this. And it allows you to, instead of having to do all the seed bed preparation, you can get in and just slice through the residue and put your seed down. And I've had great success working even in orchards with it. So I think this is a good way to go. And unfortunately, it's a little expensive for small growers to own, but you probably, what was nice for a while was that one of the local seed companies rented these, and it was great, except they kept having trouble with people would run them through star thistle, and they'd come back all bound up with star thistle stems, and it would take hours to get the material out of it. So they finally gave up and said, it's too much work, we're not going to do this anymore. But this is a very, very useful tool if you're doing a lot of cover cropping, and I kind of recommend having one. There's other kinds of drills, but this is, for me, the best that I've seen for no-till seeding. And I kind of recommend going to no-till wherever you can. Next slide. This was an interesting device that I saw when I was in Chile a few years ago, and it's basically kind of a low-tech conservation tillage system. So instead of using a disc to invert the soil, the blades in the front of this are a standard cultivator with kind of sweeps, and they pop the soil up and kind of cut the roots as they go. And then those blades that you see on the back articulate, so they go in and around underneath the vines. So they're just ground driven, so there's no expensive hydraulics like with Clemens or anything. So it's not a real expensive piece of equipment, but it works pretty effectively. And you can see you end up with a fairly clean looking vineyard for if you're doing a total tillage approach. They do that in Chile because it's just kind of the culture. They use cover crops, but they like going to clean till during the summer when the vines are growing, and that's the approach that they use. And they've moved away from herbicides with this. The equipment's pretty reasonable. So a Clemens might cost you $20,000. This was fabricated by the grower, and I think he spent around $3,000 to put the whole thing together. And it's very easy to replace blades and not a lot of expensive parts. Next slide. Just a couple other resources. This is the website, the North Coast Soil Health Hub, that is managed by our local Mendocino County Resource Conservation District. It's also supported by UC Cooperative Extension and the Natural Resource Conservation Service offices. So you should check it out. There's a lot of interesting information in there. We're trying to come up with a soil health index for California based on the soil health indices that are used in Cornell. And it's a long-term task. We're trying to figure out what's the range of organic matter and nutrients that you should expect in a well-maintained vineyard. So it's a long-term project, and we're building data for it. This has been supported by also another specialty crop grant, and this is a site worth going to. Next slide. These are books that I recommend you have on your bookshelf if you're a serious grower. The Organic Wine Growing Manual, which I was the lead author on and editor and co-editor with a couple other people. The cover cropping book, it's become a classic. It probably needs updating. So Cam Yar, it's up to you and your colleagues to think about doing some more cover crop testing. And we wrote this after about 3 or 4 years of really intensive testing, and it was published in 1998. And golly, it's hard to believe it's a career generation later, but it's time for that probably to be evaluated and maybe something better put together. And then the Great Pest Management book is something that also I'm a co-author in. It is kind of a really useful book for you to have on your shelf about various pests that you're likely to deal with, and then using that with the website with the IPM program that has pesticide recommendations or pest management recommendations, I really should say. You can do a lot of good for yourself to understand what's going on in your vineyard and how to manage them if something's getting out of hand. So next slide. That's it. Thank you very much for sitting through an hour of this. It's kind of a long time, but hopefully from this you'll get inspired. What I hope with my discussions like this is that somewhere along the line a light bulb went off in your head and you go, wow, I could do that. And that's one of the things I really encourage, is for you to experiment with these different crops and plants. And you don't have to do the whole darn vineyard with it. Just start with one area and see if you like it or not. And I really like small test plots. I think that we learned a lot from our small test plots over the years, and we would often do just a few thousand square feet and maybe have 10 different things in it. And from that, we wrote our book, and a lot of the cover cropping you see around California today started from fairly humble beginnings and experiments that I did in 1988 and 89 with people like Chuck Ingalls and Bob Bugg and people who unfortunately are retired or dead or no longer with us. So that's why it's important for you guys to pick up the torch and start learning on your own about these different cover crop species and where they're appropriate and where they work. So experiment on. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions if people have questions.
Thank you so much, Glenn, for that awesome presentation. I'm going to put on this slide for a second. I hope you see our new slide here, and a couple of quick announcements. First, I would say again, I am the relatively new farm advisor for the Contra Costa and Alameda County. So if you are interested in doing experimenting or developing further your cover cropping, certainly please reach out to me. I'd be glad to work with you. And we're going to do a bit of question and answer, somewhat of a relatively small group. So maybe if you're interested in having a little more of a discussion with Glenn, you could raise your hand and maybe we could have you speak. Otherwise, feel free to put your questions in the question and answer box. And then finally, when you do leave the webinar, you'll be prompted to fill out a survey evaluating this program. And we are very grateful. It helps us justify our work to our funders, and also helps us to make sure that we are developing the best programming for you. Mm-hmm. Also, wanted to point out that we had Julio Contreras of the Urban Ag program in the East Bay join us, and Rob Benetton is usually with us too, but they both had other things they had to, another presentation they had to work on today. So they weren't able to join us, or at least Julio has just joined us. So with that, I see we have one participant who raised their hand. So I will turn on, you should be, Mr. Matson should be able to ask your question.
Yes. I bought last year a small vineyard in retirement. It's a 1 1/4 acre, 3 different varieties. And I decided this year to try to, we had a good harvest last year, but I decided this year to try some of the things that have been recommended. So I took a 1/4 acre and I mulched underneath the vines. And I tried planting a cover crop. I waited and waited and waited for rain and never showed up, or hasn't showed up at all. So I rototilled it. I don't have a tractor. I rototilled it and planted barley and a red clover or crimson clover, which I fed all my bunnies with, and all the squirrels loved it. So I've got nothing out of it. What would you recommend I try next time?
Well, it's, I don't want you to feel like a failure, because odds are you did everything right. It's just that nature failed us and it didn't rain. That combination should have worked pretty well. And normally you would have had a really good stand from it. So as I told you, you just absolutely can't go wrong with the mustards as a group. If your goal is to grow organic matter, the mustards are very inexpensive, and even in a low rainfall year, they usually perform. We can get a pretty decent stand on even like, 5 or 6 inches of rainfall. So that I would think about maybe using that in the future.
We've had 3 inches of rainfall.
3, huh? That's tough. That's really tough. So we've done a little better up here. We've had about 10 inches, but we're still kind of in, it's not enough for us. I mean, we're used to having 30, so it's going to be a very difficult year for us, and the lack of rain is going to be a problem all over the state.
And I have drip irrigation, so that's not a problem for the vines. But I've got no good way to irrigate an acre of my 1 1/4 acres. What I did do this year is just put the sprinklers out in the 1/4 acre to get anything out there. The barley sprouted, but the bunnies loved it.
Yeah, it's just one of those hard luck years. I mean, that's the fun of farming. It's always a roll of the dice. So here, almost everybody has overhead frost protection because it gets chilly in the springtime. So it's easy for us to bring cover crops up. And I didn't mention that, but that's one of the things that we do pretty routinely, even with our no-till vines, is that we'll post-harvest put on a couple inches of water if we can. And that allows us to get the cover crop started before the leaves come down and we go into winter.
Yeah, well, I don't have that irrigation ability.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
In the 1/4 acre I have a hose bib out there, and that's about it.
So another cover crop that I recommend for fairly dry areas is Bur Clover. And you can actually get burless Bur Clover. There's one of the cultivars called Santiago that doesn't have the little burrs that stick in your socks. But of all the legumes, that's probably one of the ones that is the best for being able to grow with limited water in a drier climate. I'm having to hedge a little bit though on this, because we're finding out that it may be a host for the buffalo tree hopper, that the tri-cornered alfalfa hopper, which has been implicated in moving around red blotch disease, and it may be an alternative host. So we're kind of concerned about that. So that's, until we have more information, I'm kind of backing off on recommending that as a cover crop. However, it does grow a lot. We find it all over California, sort of naturalized. So used to see it all the time in the Central Coast when I lived there, down around Paso Robles. It's great.
Well, I would love to have a legume in
I'm
there
sure it'll go well in other
along
areas.
with barley next year. And I just waited around until maybe we get a couple inches of rain, and it never happened.
That's too
fall.
bad. Yeah. So the other thing that you can put in with barley pretty effectively is any of the peas or vetches, but just make sure you make the right vetch choice. So you want purple vetch or common vetch because they're not very invasive. Hairy vetch is very invasive, so you want to be sure you don't use that.
Okay.
And I'm going to say, and you can certainly get in touch with me if you want to. We can explore this maybe further and see if we can figure out. Again, as I've been learning over the time of this series, is that cover cropping is pretty complex, and it's kind of as much art as science, and experience is usually kind of helps the grower adapt to the local area. So we can certainly, you can discuss that with me if you'd like to get in touch. Also, I'd like to
open wildland around me too. So control of rabbits and squirrels and all of that is very problematic.
Definitely. Thank you very much for that question. And I think that I am curious to see if Glenn has some comments generally about, if we're moving towards drier years in general, whether that's going to suggest changes in possibilities in how we approach cover crops. But let me say, we're going to move on to a few questions, other questions, and also for those of you who would like to speak, we are, just to let you know, we are recording this, and you can let me know, if whether you want to, whether it's all right to include that in the recorded session. Glenn, did you want to make any further comment about just if we're having, I imagine that we're going to have some dry years, some wet years, and you always hope it comes out in the balance. But if we're moving towards more dry years, what do you see as the implications for what might be differences in how cover crops are approached?
So we're going to go with things that are a little bit more faster growing, low dormancy kind of winter annuals that can come in and germinate fairly quickly and then bloom and finish their life cycle in a short period. So we probably would be moving away from kind of the long winter dormancy subterranean clovers and looking at stuff that more like mustards that germinate quick and finish their life cycle quick. They'll do the whole thing in about 60 to 90 days, and the subclovers take more like around 120 to 150 days. So, and then also small grains do pretty good with low moisture. So we'd be going for things with shorter winter dormancies that finish up sooner. And I still would recommend thinking about no-till and then also mowing them out fairly early in the spring.
And I would imagine, besides just having the setup to irrigate, irrigation is always going to kind of play into the cost benefit analysis, right?
Yeah, irrigating cover crops is probably not super sustainable. And even right now, we have overhead frost protection systems, and we're getting a lot of pressure this year because we share our water with urban use downstream from us. We're getting a lot of pressure not to do frost protection with water, and that's unfortunate, but I don't know how it's going to turn out. We do have some alternatives. I've done a bunch of work using copper sprays to control ice nucleating bacteria, which cause freezing. And I know some of our growers are going to do that this year instead of trying to overhead sprinkle to protect their vines. So just depending on water availability. So we put about 3/4 pound of copper on starting from when bud break, and this keeps it's a pretty good antibiotic, so it keeps the ice nucleating bacteria under control. In order for frost to form, you have to have ice nucleators there, and if you can keep those populations down low, you don't get freezing. The tissue can actually super cool and go down as low as 28 degrees without any damage. So I know personally I'm going to be putting copper in my sprays this year. I normally put stylet oil on to start my powdery mildew program, so I'll have some Poside in with that, which I'll put on probably once a week through frost season. Frost season lasts about 3 weeks, so 3 applications will be good.
Thanks. I'm going to ask a few other questions. I'm sure there's so many endless topics to discuss, but Jerry asked, how would buckwheat do in sandy soil in an area like Lodi? And I want to piggyback on top of that. We have some really sandy, almost pure sand areas in parts of Contra Costa County as well. So in addition to that question about buckwheat specifically, if you can comment on cover cropping in very sandy soil.
Well, it's hard. It's hard to get stuff to grow. So again, what does best are things that are going to be growing when there's moisture in the ground, and that's wintertime. And again, kind of short season winter annuals are probably how we're going to go. So our best bet there would be small grains and mustards. They'll do the best of anything that you're likely to grow, because trying to do buckwheat in sandy soil is not good unless there's going to be moisture in it somehow. And again, we definitely wouldn't be sprinkling during the growing season. So don't think buckwheats would really work out good for kind of a summer cover. What some of the growers have done to create insectaries is about every 5th row, they will put micro sprinklers underneath the vines that have kind of a narrow pattern, and they'll seed things in there that can serve as insectaries, including things like buckwheat and some of the other members of the carrot family that have those flowers like Queen Anne's lace, and they're pretty good choices. So and also members of the mustard family that bloom through the summer. So sweet alyssum is a real favorite. Sweet alyssum tends to naturalize, and it's a very, very good insectary plant. And they'll do a little bit of micro sprinkling about every 5th row underneath the vines, and that would be one way you could consider having something like buckwheat or other summer insectary plants available to you. I've seen that done successfully, and you still get quite a bit of benefit from it. So that's one possibility. But otherwise, trying to put it directly into sand and having it grow in the summer probably won't happen.
Okay, thank you. Another question, Scott asks, anything I can do with high numbers of dagger and ring nematodes in my soil to prevent problems in my vineyard?
And before Glenn answers, I'll say, Scott, if there's more you want to add, let us know and we can let you talk.
Sure. So, there are certainly, there's been some selections made of mustard seed that have nematode suppressive qualities to it. The problem is that if you have living roots, the nematodes tend to be in those living roots. So there isn't anything we really have that we can plant that you can plant sort of like over the roots that's going to make the nematodes disappear. I've never seen any research that suggested that works. Typically how our nematode suppressing cover crops work is that you have to pull the vineyard out. Then you go in and you fallow and cover crop with combinations of things like cereal ryegrass, annual ryegrass, or some of these special kinds of mustards. There's one called I'm forgetting its names now. There's several cultivars that are proprietal that have been worked out that have the chemicals that basically are in horseradish. You know how you taste horseradish and how kind of hot and spicy it is. So they have those same groups of chemicals that are quite toxic to nematodes, and they'll bring the numbers down. They won't eliminate them, but they'll bring them down. It's not as good as the olden days when we had methyl bromide and you put that in and everything was gone. Create a biological vacuum. We don't have anything that's quite that powerful available to us, but they're helpful. So there's also some indication that just having more biological activity in the soil is good. So by using compost and by using any cover crop, we can sometimes help suppress the nematode populations. But I can't give you a recipe that would specifically go after the dagger and ring nematodes that would take them out. And it's a real problem for organic growers because there are some chemicals available, but most of them don't really work that super duper well. So for conventional growers, we have some things that we can put through the drip system and suppress nematodes. But for everybody else, things like Diterra, they're not that red hot. So it's a real problem if you have a existing vineyard that has high dagger and ring nematode numbers. Probably ultimately, some of the nematode resistant rootstocks that Andy Walker is in the process of reading right now is really how we'd like to handle the nematode situations. I hope that helps. But it's always, whenever nematodes come up, it's always really hard to have a good discussion to help people with what do you do with a vineyard that's existing that has an issue.
Right. Again, it's again, feel free to reach out to me if you're in my area. And in fact, there's again, an impression I have is that cover cropping is something you develop with experience over the years and experimentation. And but I am curious if you specifically in this case and generally, Glenn, do you know of kind of complementing conventional pest management or weed management with cover crops? You mentioned a lot of organic growers in your area, but are there ways to combine these cover cropping practices with some of the conventional management practices?
Absolutely, and that's one of the things that I was really pleased to see during the course of my career is when I started, cover cropping was kind of rare. There were just a few growers doing it in our region in 1987 when I came on board, but within 10 years, it's now a pretty standard practice. And you see a lot of people who are in the like the Lodi rules program or some of the other sustainable certification programs. They cover crop now, and a lot of them are using fairly simple winter annual covers, but they see the benefits to soil, so it's totally compatible. And it does enhance some of your pest management issues too, because whenever you create habitat, you create places where you're going to find generalist predators and parasitoids. However, the entomologists are always telling me just don't get too excited because it's really hard a lot of times to show cause and effect, because just because you find a bunch of minute pirate bugs in your cover crop doesn't mean they're necessarily going to help you in your vines. So it's not as predictable as spraying an insecticide to take out a pest. But in general, what I saw with all of the folks who farmed organically using cover crops in our region is their pest problems tended to go down, particularly mites. When we just had Western grape leafhopper, they saw reductions in their population numbers too. What's changed is that whenever we bring in a new exotic pest, and in this case it's the Virginia creeper leafhopper, we're not getting the same effects. The same complex of biological control agents doesn't work on them. So we're having to recalibrate and introduce new biocontrol agents, and it's taking us some time. So that's really kind of messed up our organic program here locally. So these are all things that change. And in your area, I don't know if you found vine mealybug, but that would be another one that would be pretty devastating to have come into an organic system. It's very difficult to control them without conventional insecticides.
Thank you. I was curious about, and I would encourage our attendees also, please do submit any questions you have. I was wondering, again, especially in the North Coast and mentioning some of the biodynamic and organic growers, to what extent the kind of price premium that they get, how much does that go towards justifying kind of what might be more expensive practices? Or do you see that cover crops are readily used in different ways through a whole range of economic payoffs?
Yeah, so it's It's a good question. So here's where I've ended up in my own personal vineyard, since I farm just a little vineyard. It's 7.5 acres. Well, at least it's not little by necessarily by North Coast standards, but certainly little by Valley standards. And I have 4 different varieties in there. And I've cultivated a group of niche customers that like the way that I farm, and I farm pretty close to organic, except I'm not certified because nobody really wants to pay the extra $200 a ton for certification. So on those 7.5 acres, I grow usually between 40 and 50 tons of fruit, and it's premium. You know, it's white, and I get paid well. In most cases, around $2,000 a ton for it. So they really like the quality of the fruit that comes out of there, because some of them are natural winemakers where all they want to do is crush it, and they don't want to do any interventions. And they find that fruit coming out of my vineyard goes through that process really, really well. When they get fruit from some of the conventional vineyards, because they're using different chemicals on it, they sometimes get some off odors, they sometimes get stuck fermentations, they sometimes have things don't turn out good. Whereas the fruit that I grow tends to work out really well for them in a program where all they're doing is crushing fruit. It also goes to some conventional winemakers that also like it, because they say, yeah, the quality of your fruit is really, really good. I don't know what it is, but it makes really nice wine. And ultimately, that's kind of what most people are interested in, is they want good fruit to make good wine. And that's been sort of the emphasis, I think, of a lot of people working in the area of sort of sustainable growing, is that I don't know how many winemakers have told me, what I really want to do is get fruit that I can crush and it turns into wine, and there's no nightmares, there's no problems. It goes through fermentation, it goes through malolactic fermentation, and it's ready to bottle. And meanwhile, I don't have to do anything other than just watch it do that. And I keep the barrels topped up, and I make sure that nothing's getting out of hand. And I typically, a lot of them use very low levels of sulfites so that they're not interfering with natural processes. So that's kind of the direction that I think a lot of small growers are going, is trying to be able to grow the kind of fruit that winemakers can use that ends up with a light touch. It's not to say conventional growers can't do that too. I mean, I don't think that there's other ways to certainly manage fruit coming into the winery, and that's a whole nother discussion that I'm really not qualified to talk about, because I'm not a winemaker. But you know, the approach with kind of moderate quality fruit is sometimes you have to have a little more active role in making sure nothing's getting out of hand, because something might be slightly imbalanced in the fruit coming in. I spend a lot of extra money cultivating my fruit in terms of some hand manipulations, like shoot positioning and leafing, to create an environment where I don't have to use a lot of chemicals. So I'm pretty minimalist. So I have 2 applications of stylet oil and 3 sulfur dustings, and I'm done. So you know, that's not a lot of chemicals, and I'm fairly fortunate. I've never needed to apply insecticides other than stylet oil, and it works good. And I see a lot of people wanting to do similar kinds of programs. That's kind of what a lot of folks are after, is just very sustainable sort of approach. So I do use compost, I do use cover cropping. So those are 2 things that are part of my program, but I'm not technically organic. And I'll be honest, if I had something invasive come into my vineyard, like Virginia creeper leafhopper, and it was going to really mess up my crop, I would spray. You know, I mean, I'm not going to let things get out of hand, but I will do kind of a light touch as much as I can, and there are customers out there that want that kind of fruit.
Thank you. And I don't know if you can adjust your position with respect to your microphone. Sometimes your voice is, at least with my speaker, seems a little bit unclear, but
It might be me.
Maybe just get a little closer.
Yeah. Is that any better? Yeah.
That's much better. I think so. Great. Julio was asking about Tansy facilia specifically, in terms of are there challenges with growing it, or what are some of the recommendations?
Tansy facilia is a great cover crop. It's pretty easy to grow. It's a Cal native. It germinates fairly readily. It grows well. It's tough. You know, it
I don't know if Glenn has frozen on my screen, hopefully.
it does need to be reseeded every year. It does make a pretty good seed bed, or I mean a seed bank, so it will set a lot of seed, but it does require tillage to get going. It has to have some kind of soil disturbance. But yeah, it's a great cover crop, and it's visited very heavily by pollinators and other kinds of insects that are attracted to flowers because it has stamens that stick out. Sometimes it makes people itchy.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. I don't, your voice cut out for me a few times, but I don't know if it was just for me or in general, but I think we got most of that. We still have about 5 minutes if you have questions, and we'll do a little wrap up at the end. But I have a few other points of discussion if nobody else does. One of the things that I think is, again, we already kind of discussed it, but I think is really key as we think about climate and sustainability in farming, with the benefits to soil structure and water retention. How do you see, Glenn, kind of the balance between the long-term investment in cover crops and possibly the need to add water, and what might be the payoff in terms of having better water retention down the line?
Can you hear me? My picture seems to be frozen.
Yeah, your picture's frozen, but I hear you, thankfully.
Okay. You know, we're kind of in a rural area, and our connectivity sometimes kind of goes in and out. So, so as far as, you know, building climate resiliency is something that we're all going to have to think about here in the future in California, because things are definitely changing. There's no question that we are going through a different sort of moisture regime than we used to be in. And what I see happening is that we tend to get most of our moisture through 3 or 4 atmospheric river episodes. So kind of building your soil to hold water and take water is something that I think is really a good idea. So that's why I tend to be in favor of no-till farming, because that does that fairly effectively. The other thing is that in general, I would say design your vineyards to be more drought tolerant, use more vigorous rootstocks, and so things like 110R and 1103 Paulson and certainly are probably a direction I'd rather see people go than putting in 10114 or some of these other rootstocks that aren't as drought tolerant. So I think we have to start building our vines with resiliency. We have to think about, I like cane pruning because we can adjust the vines to be big or small depending on the rainfall season. So in a season like this, you're better off with vines with a smaller canopy if you don't have much water, so that there's less fruit for the vines to ripen. So they can do better than if they start stalling out for water. So these are some of the things that I've noted that I think are important to improve our ability to deal with uncertain weather.
Great. And to follow up a little bit on that, as I was reading the, I hope that doesn't mean that we lost. Oh, we did lose Glenn.
We lost our panelist.
Well, maybe he can join us again in a moment, but we're certainly grateful to have Glenn, who, like I mentioned, has a really long career in grape growing in the North Coast, and a lot of great. And there he is. He's back.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No problem. So, and if you want, maybe you can turn your video off if that makes things a little more stable.
How's that?
It certainly seems okay. Yeah, great. We can hear you. So we have just a few minutes, or maybe just one. So I don't know if I had so many other questions to ask, and I don't know which one to choose. Are there no other questions from our participants? Let me just ask a general question. Are there situations in which, you know, a grower can say, no, I really just can't cover crop in this situation? Or do you think that, you know, under almost any condition, you can kind of approach it and tweak it and get it?
You know, the folks who are farming on sandy soils is really a challenge. And what I would be doing there, if I were working in sandy soils, I'd be looking at leaning more towards a composting short winter annual farming system where we're using mustards, probably because they're so short. We can get a crop up and finished in about 10 to 12 weeks. And I'd be putting on pretty good amounts of compost in there. So I know that you have some real interesting vineyards in Contra Costa County on sandy soils. And that's probably the direction I would head with them. And that's a place where during the summer I'd have pretty clean tillage. It'd be pretty much my approach, because they're just, it's hard to keep things going under those kind of conditions. A lot of times the vine roots will go down quite a distance to find some level of moisture, but the surfaces can be pretty much a desert in the summertime.
Great, thank you. I think that's all the time we have. I do want to take the opportunity to pass the microphone to Ben Weiss, who will maybe say a few words about the cost share programs that the RCD helps growers with. And I will just emphasize again, please, to do fill out the evaluation survey that will pop up when you log out. And thank you so much, Glenn, for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. This is fun. This is a chance for me to nerd out on something I really love, and it's great that there's other people interested in it too. So carry on, everybody.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Ben, just to say a few words about cost.
So thanks everyone for attending. Thanks, Glenn, for presenting. Just a big plug here for what's called the NRCS Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP. We're in the middle of a batching period right now. We'll have another one in June. It's a cost share program that can fund cover cropping on your vineyard, or in most other row crop systems, I would say. So if you're interested in that, feel free to contact me at Contra Costa RCD, or get in touch with your local NRCS office, because they all have the same dates. And then another program that we're waiting on right now is the state's CDFA's Healthy Soils program. They just sent around some funding opportunities for folks like Derek and I to help people sign up, which is a good indicator that there is probably going to be another round of Healthy Soils program funding, but I have no idea when that is going to be. So the best way to learn more about that is go onto the CDFA website, or just be a part of our mailing list. As soon as we get information, we'll put it out there, because we want to get people signed up and get going on cover cropping as soon as we can. But obviously we'll work with you to figure out something that meets your needs and meets your system. Yeah, I think that's all I got.
Thank you, Ben. And I will say finally, for those of you interested in continuing to learn about cover crops and experimenting with them, whatever level of experience you have, I am the farm advisor for Contra Costa and Alameda counties. And if I'm not your farm advisor, you can certainly reach out to the UC Cooperative Extension farm advisor in your counties. And I see Brenda has her hand raised, so I'll turn on her mic. Go ahead, Brenda, if you like.
Yeah, I'm not sure if Glenn's still there, but I had a question. Is there a situation where, or a rule of thumb, as far as when to dish down your cover crop, besides getting the bump, you would do it for nitrogen, but if you do that, is it better off just to, like, you've worked so hard establishing your cover crop, and I have established native cover crop, because then we're looking at doing the carbon exchange.
Sure. The goals that you're after going to be different. So, one of the things that sounds like we're getting some. All right. So typically we want everything mowed down by bud break. That's the time we want to be finished. And if we take nitrogen, it's bloom time. So those are our two places where we would consider disting. Does that help?
Hopefully that's it. And I lost my sound for a second, but I think that's all the time we have. Again, thank you very much for joining us. And we have other programs coming up. We have cover cropping in orchards. So if you're interested, please check out the webpage on the bottom right there, ucanr.edu/covercropscoco.
And feel free to come back and listen to this on YouTube as well. It'll be posted.
That's right. And you can find it on the East Bay Crops YouTube channel. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the afternoon, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thanks.